Conflict in Communication. Week 6, Nonverbal Communication. Understanding Nonverbal Behavior. This video provides an overview of several key features of nonverbal communication that we can take into consideration when analyzing conflict in communication. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify and define nonverbal communication, list and describe the functions of nonverbal communication, and identify and define nonverbal communication channels. Characteristics of nonverbal communication. Last class, we spent quite a bit of time talking about how we go about differentiating between verbal and nonverbal communication. And I think we came to the realization that the distinction between the two isn't necessarily as clear-cut as we might want to assume. However, if we're operating from the textbook definition of verbal and nonverbal communication, we need to sort of structure it along the lines of whether or not language is involved. And again, we're assuming that language is a symbol system that uses words. And again, with language, a one-to-one correspondence exists between symbols and the letters or words that they represent. So verbal communication would include spoken language, written language, and sign language, as well as things like Morse code and semaphore. Nonverbal communication is characterized by far more ambiguity. Nonverbal communication is generally multi-channeled and lacks the same one-to-one, rule-bound correspondence between symbols and what they are meant to mean. Or you might say it lacks the same direct correspondence between the symbol and corresponding referent. Another major difference is that we can choose to start or stop using verbal communication. That is, we can stop communicating with language. We can stop speaking or writing. It's intermittent. However, nonverbal communication is continuous. We cannot stop doing it. We are always sending messages, intentionally or not, through various nonverbal channels. Functions of nonverbal communication. There are two main categories of functions. Primary functions, which includes the specific purpose of a particular nonverbal behavior, and secondary functions, which are sort of the general purposes nonverbal behaviors serve within communication interactions. In terms of primary functions, we can ask ourselves, does a particular nonverbal behavior serve to replace or substitute a verbal message, in which case it would be called an emblem, complement or add to a verbal message, in which case it would be called an illustrator, regulate communication interactions, in which case it would be called, obviously, a regulator, or does the particular nonverbal behavior relieve tension or satisfy a bodily need, in which case it would be called an adapter. And lastly, does a particular nonverbal behavior convey an emotion, in which case it would be called an affect display. When talking about secondary functions, we can ask if nonverbal behaviors are working to make a first impression, maintain or violate expectations, to connect with others, or to build, maintain, or even terminate a relationship. Nonverbal behaviors that replace or substitute a verbal message are called emblems, and these are body movements that stand on their own as replacements for words. And generally, these convey a clear and obvious message to all members of the same cultural community. One example of this would be nodding or shaking your head for yes or no. However, as the textbook points out, even this can actually vary depending upon cultural context. And it suggests, for example, if you are in Bulgaria, to be careful, because in that context, nodding means no, and shaking your head means yes. Nonverbal behaviors that complement or add to a verbal message are called illustrators. And these are body movements that accent or work in unison with what is said verbally. So hence, these are different from emblems because they do not have meaning on their own and must be accompanied by verbal communication. So examples of this would be things like pointing while saying over there, or smiling while saying I love you. Nonverbal behaviors that are used to regulate interaction are called regulators. And these are basically body movements that control the flow of conversation. Or more specifically, they control turn taking, which is the actually very complex process of how we go about deciding who will speak at any given time during a conversation. And there's a few different ways that we can actually engage and use these regulators. We can use them to indicate that we are done speaking, wherein you might say change the intonation of your voice and lean forward to kind of invite the other person to start speaking. Or we can use them to indicate that we want to speak by perhaps leaning forward and taking in a sharp intake of breath. Or we can use them to encourage someone to keep speaking, such as by using eye contact and nodding. Raising your hand in class would be another example of a regulator. Adapters, or manipulators, are body movements that relieve tension or satisfy a bodily need, and these often involve manipulation of one's own body. So these would include things like scratching your head or your arm, or tapping your chin, or changing your position in a chair, or playing with your pen or your glasses. And again, these are nonverbal behaviors in that they unconsciously convey information. And these are actually often interpreted as a sign of anxiety. Nonverbal behaviors that convey emotion are called affect displays. And again, these are body movements that tell others about our emotional state. And they include lots of different things: smiling, crying, or the use of different body postures. In fact, overall, the emotional content of messages are primarily conveyed through nonverbal means. This also relates to our earlier discussions about the content and relational dimensions of messages. Moving on to the secondary functions of nonverbal behavior, the first of these is making first impressions. In fact, nonverbal behavior is extremely important for making first impressions because those impressions are primarily based upon easily accessed information. We generally make very quick judgments about things like how we interpret someone's level of professionalism or friendliness or openness based upon their nonverbal behaviors. But of course, this is heavily mediated by things like culture and context. Nonverbal behavior also is a way in which we maintain or violate these expectations. Related to this idea is this notion of expectation violation theory, which basically explains how violations of expectations can alter our first impressions. Basically, the idea here is that if someone violates our first impression of them, our perception of them will shift quite drastically. So, for example, let's say based upon your first impression of a person, you assume that they're actually very, very friendly, but then they violate that expectation. Your perception of them will shift drastically, where you're more likely to say, wow, they're actually a terrible person, or they're really mean. Nonverbal communication also helps us to connect with others. This is based on the deceptively simple sounding idea that we get closer to the people we like and try to distance ourselves from people that we don't like. Specifically, we respond to what's called immediacy behavior. This is communication behavior that increases our feeling of closeness to and liking for another person. Another way to put it is that these are behaviors that decrease our sense of physical and psychological distance from another person. So this would be things like eye contact and smiling and nodding. This occurs in interpersonal interactions, but might be more obvious when watching, say, a public speaker. Indeed, the use of immediacy behaviors by a public speaker seeks to convey the message that the speaker is likable, confident, and even more competent. Nonverbal behaviors also seek to build, maintain, and terminate relationships. Indeed, they actually convey information about the state of a relationship. So this would include things like self-grooming behaviors. So things like running your hand through your hair, or trying to make yourself neater. These are things that are usually associated with flirting and the development of romantic relationships. Touch is another way that we use to build and maintain a relationship. We also use a variety of withdrawal behaviors to increase distance between us and another person and or to terminate a relationship. So things like avoiding eye contact or not speaking or changing the way in which we speak to another person can indicate that we want to create more distance and perhaps terminate the relationship. So here again is our list of primary and secondary functions. Primary functions again include replacing or substituting a verbal message, complementing or adding to a verbal message, regulating communication interactions, relieving tension or satisfying bodily needs, and conveying emotion. Secondary functions include make a first impression, maintaining or violating expectations, connecting with others, and building, maintaining, or terminating a relationship. Nonverbal communication channels. As I stated at the beginning of the video, nonverbal communication is multi-channeled. There's lots of different channels that we use constantly to convey messages through nonverbal communication. Some of these are ones you'd probably assume. Facial expressions, eye contact, and gaze. Different forms of vocal cues and the usage of silence. Body movement, posture, stance, and gesture. Touch. And then there are things that maybe are not as obvious. Clothing and personal artifacts convey nonverbal messages. Color choices. Our usage of space and distance, and this related idea of territoriality. Our relationship to time and physical settings. All of these are channels through which we convey information non-verbally. The first channel I'm going to focus on is facial expressions, eye contact, and gaze. This includes the multitude of ways in which we use facial expressions and, in particular, our eyes to communicate. Some research suggests that some of this nonverbal communication is actually universally shared amongst humans. That is, we have a tendency to express things like anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise in similar ways. However, much of how we use facial expressions, and in particular eye contact, is shaped by culture. Consider, for example, how different forms of eye contact can indicate respect in different ways in different cultures. The second major nonverbal communication channel I want to talk about is vocal cues and the use of silence. This might be a bit confusing, as this indicates that nonverbal communication can include communication through sound. Specifically, it involves paralanguage. Paralanguage are elements of speech that we do not recognize as part of language. And there's a few different forms of this. This includes intonation, the way our voices rise and fall with how we speak. So, for example, the way in which our voices may rise and fall when we're asking a question. Tone, vocal quality that conveys emotion, such as enthusiasm. So, for example, if I were to say, I'm so excited, and, oh, I'm so excited. Obviously, this is me using tone in a different way. Pitch, which includes how low or high our register of voice is. Speech rate, how fast or how slow you speak. I happen to have a very, very fast speech rate, which I have to be careful with. Hesitations or disfluencies, which are pauses or filler sounds, such as and silence. And again, silence can operate in different ways. Silence can be used as a way to create space for listening without judgment and can convey a high level of respect. But silence can also be a form of punishment, such as when you give someone the silent treatment or ignore them. And silence can also be used as a way to increase the impact of the things that you do say. Consider, for example, how a comedian might pause before or after they give the punchline of a joke. Body movement, posture, stance, and hand gestures are also obviously channels for nonverbal communication. The study of how these things operate is called kinesics. Often, we are less aware of the information that we send nonverbally through this channel, and this can result in what's termed nonverbal leakage. And this is information that we unintentionally communicate nonverbally. Touch is another nonverbal communication channel, and it's often a way in which we communicate our desire to show comfort and affection to other people. We also get information by watching how others respond to us when we touch them. Now, again, of course, this is heavily mediated by relational, contextual, and cultural norms and expectations. Moving on to perhaps less obvious forms of nonverbal communication, we can talk about clothing and personal artifacts. Now, in terms of clothing, this includes things like very explicit symbols or uniforms, as well as general norms of dress, and how these different norms of dress communicate particular messages. We can also talk about personal belongings, and this includes things like the way in which we display personal belongings, for example, in our homes. It also includes things like personal objects and our use of lighting, and even things like how neat we keep our personal spaces. Color choice is another form of nonverbal communication channel. This includes things like the color of clothing, as well as, for example, what colors we use to paint or decorate our home and personal spaces. The way in which we interpret color choice is shaped by culture. We also use space and distance as a nonverbal communication channel, and proxemics is the study of how people perceive and use space. Basically, we all have these different layers of personal bubbles of space around us, and we expect that people will generally respect these personal physical boundaries. In fact, we generally don't realize that we have them until someone violates our expectations and gets a little too close or not close enough. The extent to which we expect someone to get physically closer to us depends upon our relationship with this person, which the anthropologist Edward T. Hall classified into four differential spatial zones. Intimate zones are reserved for closer personal communication, and generally for those with whom we're in very close intimate relationships with. Personal zones are generally still quite close and are generally reserved for close friends and family members. Social zones, which are usually around, say, 1.5 meters, are generally reserved for more casual acquaintances. And lastly, we have public zones, which is generally how close we expect people to get to us in terms of sort of general public discourse and engagements in public space. Barrier behaviors are the various strategies that we use to create or fix a barrier between ourselves and another person. So consider, for example, what people often do when they're on an elevator and then someone else gets on the elevator. You might notice that people often try to put as much space as they possibly can between themselves and the other person. And we also do things like avoid eye contact. These would be forms of barrier behaviors. Related to the way in which we use space is this idea of territoriality. And territoriality is basically our desire to mark our space. And we use various territorial behaviors to mark space. So anytime you come into class, say, and you put your jacket on the back of your chair, that would be a territorial behavior. Other forms of territorial behavior include things like putting up a fence between neighbors. Chromatics is the study of how people perceive, structure, value, and react to time. And this helps us to understand that our use of time is also a nonverbal communication channel. Consider, for example, how you react when someone is late for a meeting or appointment. Do you perceive this as a serious violation of expectations, or is not really a big deal? This perception is shaped by culture. Monochronic cultures view time as linear and rely on clocks and schedules to regulate events. Polychronic cultures view time as elastic and are regulated more by natural cycles and seasons. Our perception is also shaped by power relationships. It isn't, for example, considered too problematic when those in higher power positions, doctors, lawyers, or university instructors, make their patients, clients, or students wait. But that behavior wouldn't be acceptable the other way around. Lastly, physical settings also convey nonverbal messages. This includes factors such as overall building design and architecture, layout, and furniture choice. These aspects convey messages about hierarchy and access, what kinds of relationships should occur in a given space, and the extent to which an individual has the right to personalize space, which also sort of suggests the extent to which an individual is allowed to own the space that they're in. Hard architecture discourages the personalization of space, while soft architecture encourages it. Sociopedal settings offer physical arrangements that bring people together and foster interpersonal interactions, like sitting in a circle. Sociofugal settings are physical arrangements that force people apart. Consider, for example, the structure of a traditional lecture hall. So, those are the nonverbal communication channels: facial expressions, eye contact and gaze, vocal cues and silence, and again, this idea of paralanguage, body movement, posture, stance, and gestures, touch, clothing and personal artifacts, color choice, space and distance, and this idea of territoriality, time, and physical settings. This video provided an overview of several key features of nonverbal communication that we can take into consideration when analyzing conflict in communication. For this week's quiz, you should be able to identify and define nonverbal communication, list and describe the functions of nonverbal communication, and identify and define nonverbal communication channels.